Leaders' questions. I call on Deputy Billy Kelleher.
Thanks, Ceann Corda. Tánaiste, yesterday the VHI announced our fourth increase in 3 years in private health insurance, and I have no doubt that other health insurers will follow suit in the very near future. Now, if you were looking in from the outside, Tánaiste, you would think that this government is in coherence with insurers in trying to drive as many families as is possible out of the health insurance market. We now have a situation where over 6,000 people a month are falling out of private health insurance, and it simply is not sustainable on a number of fronts. Firstly, the more people that fall out of private health insurance, the further exacerbates the problem of a sustainable health insurance model. Now, this government has stood in terms of implementing universal health insurance, but all the policies pursued to date by this government have undermined families in trying to retain private health insurance, and it simply is not a sustainable policy that this government is pursuing. Now, Tánaiste, last night I raised the issue with regard to the costs that some hospitals are charging private health insurers. In one case, a private hospital billed an insurance company €17,000 for one night's accommodation in a private hospital. And on top of that, then, there was €2,000 for surgical procedures, but €17,000 for one night by a private hospital provider. Now, the point I'm making here, Tánaiste, is that you are talking about universal health insurance. You're talking about ensuring that as many people as possible can retain it, and those that can't afford it, the government will subsidise that. But clearly, the situation is now unsustainable. And families every day of the week, Tánaiste, are now making decisions on whether or not they will drop out their private health insurance, or whether they will fill the tank with oil or gas, or make very other basic household cuts to fund private health insurance. And this is not a luxury, Tánaiste. This is a government policy to actually, on one hand, encourage people to take out private health insurance, and at every other policy decision yet undermines that. So, Tánaiste, two questions I'll ask is, firstly, will the Minister for Finance reverse the cap on tax relief for private health insurance, in view of the fact he said it would only affect gold-plated private health insurance cover? Now, by any stretch of the imagination, it is affecting every family in this country that is presently trying to retain private health insurance. So on that front, will you reverse that attack on ordinary families who are trying to sustain private health insurance?
Thank you. Tánaiste.
Corla, I think it's fair to say that the recession has been very tough on working families. And I think that the last thing that families now need is an increase in the cost of private health insurance. I must say that at a time of increasing competition in the market, and indeed with new players seeing an opportunity in it for themselves, I share the wonder that many people have as to why prices are going up and not down. Now, as you will be aware, the government has no legal power to intervene in the pricing by VHI or by any other individual insurer. But as a government, we are very concerned about the cost of standard health insurance for hard-pressed families. And that is why the Minister for Health, Minister Riley, set up a consultative forum under an independent chairperson, Mr Pat McLaughlin, to work with health insurers, the Department of Health and the Health Insurance Authority on the issue of containing costs. Mr McLaughlin has reported on the first phase of this work, and this was published on the 26th of December 2013. Mr McLaughlin has already started on the next phase of the work, studying the key drivers of rising costs in greater depth and how these can be addressed, and will report within 3 months. The first McLaughlin report on costs made recommendations in a number of different areas, including adopting a coordinated approach to identifying and tackling fraud in the industry, and it should publish data on funds recovered from hospitals and consultants. The report also calls on the industry to fund a whistleblower initiative to assist in uncovering fraud. The report acknowledges the important role of clinical audit in identifying unnecessary claims, and it is vital that the industry makes best use of this tool to address rising costs. The report calls on insurers to make better use of existing information sources to challenge payments, in particular in relation to the most appropriate place for treatment to be provided, to ensure that patients receive quality treatment at the lowest possible cost. Implementation of money follows the patient will support this action by replacing daily charges with case-based charging. Addressing the age structure of the private health insurance market is also important. Minister Riley is currently considering measures to encourage more young people into the market, including the introduction of lifetime community rating to encourage younger people to take out private health insurance. The industry too can make better use of existing legislation by discounting premiums for full-time students under the age of 23. The report also makes a number of recommendations in relation to claims processing and admissions and discharge procedures, which Minister Riley is committing to progressing in consultation with stakeholders. I understand that Minister Riley supports the recommendations made by Mr McLaughlin and is committed to making progress in this area.
Deputy Kelleher.
Well, Tánaiste, we appreciate you sharing the wonder, but we'd much prefer if you shared the responsibility of escalating private health insurance costs. Because simply it's every policy that's being pursued by this government is inflating the cost of private health insurance to hard-pressed families. Yes, there was a recession. Yes, the country is in difficulty. Yes, unemployment is very high. But the bottom line here, Tánaiste, is that even the Minister last year for Finance coming into this House with one foul swoop of his pen drove thousands of people out of the private health insurance market. And the spurious claim that this was only going to attract a levy on the gold-plated private health insurance simply is not credible. Every family in this country will be affected by the cap on tax relief. Every family. And yet we now have a reply by the Tánaiste which gives no comfort to any family who are now making decisions as to whether or not they will be able to retain private health insurance or not. So would the Tánaiste agree that this government is undermining the health insurance market? The debt spiral continues, more people keep falling out of it, and this is making it more and more difficult for ordinary hard-pressed families to retain private health insurance, and equally it is undermining basic intergenerational solidarity and community rating where the young subsidise the old, and that simply is not sustainable. So Tánaiste, will you reverse the policy with regard to the tax relief cap, and will you look at introducing some model that will attract young people back into the the private health insurance market before it actually crumbles?
Thank you. Tánaiste.
There is a problem of rising premia for private health insurance, and the government is taking its responsibility serious in relation to rising health insurance costs, and that is why the Minister for Health established the forum under Mr McLaughlin. That is why he's already got an initial report from Mr McLaughlin, which is identifying a number of areas that have to be tackled and addressed, and there is a further body of work which is now underway and which will report within 3 months. The issue of rising costs in the health insurance market, there are a number of dimensions to it, as I've said. You instanced one yourself. I don't understand why a health insurance company should get a bill for €17,000 for one night in a hospital. I don't understand that, and I think that that is one of the issues that we have to get to the bottom of. But rising health insurance costs and the problem of health insurance premia is not a new phenomenon. It's been with us for quite a while, and this government is determined that we are going to get to the bottom of what is driving the rising cost of health insurance and to try and get that under control for families who are under pressure in relation to paying it.
Thank you.
Some of it has to do with overcharging, some of it has to do with the whole issue of competition for the young, healthy person. The budget hasn't to do with it.
Sorry.
The government is continuing. No. That's just taking a political swipe on it. There is an issue about the cost of health insurance premiums, and we're addressing that.
Thank you. Deputy MacDonald.
Tánaiste, by any standards, Louise O'Keeffe is an extremely courageous woman. Abused as a young child, no doubt deeply traumatised as a result, blocked, bullied, browbeaten and threatened by the state, she never lay down. She took her case to the European Court of Human Rights, and that court ruled this week, as you know, that the Irish state is directly liable for the inhuman and degrading treatment of an 8-year-old girl, and that further, this state offered that girl, now an adult, no remedy for that abuse. Indeed, Tánaiste, the court could have gone much further. It could have said correctly that this state prevented any degree of fairness, justice or resolution of this case for Louise. So now, Tánaiste, the responsibility and liability of this state in this case has now been firmly established. I hear in the last minutes that An Taoiseach has said some words of apology to Louise, and that is to be welcomed. It should be said, however, that given the enormity of the wrong done to this woman and others, that those words of apology should have been uttered here in the chamber of the Dáil. Tánaiste, can you tell me, does that apology extend to those other victims of abuse in primary schools? I understand that 135 other adults had previously brought cases similar to those of Louise O'Keeffe, claiming the Department of Education and that the state did not provide protection and had a liability for the abuse they suffered. And as you know, following the Supreme Court judgment in 2008, taken by Ms O'Keeffe, they received threatening letters telling them they would face legal costs unless they dropped their cases.
Thank you.
So is that threat now removed, Tánaiste? And also, Tánaiste, can you tell me why this government, your government, last year argued before the European Court that this state had no liability for what happened to children like Louise O'Keeffe?
Thank you.
How is it on your behalf that officials and council were sent on behalf of the state and this government to again attempt to face down this courageous woman?
Tánaiste.
Louise O'Keeffe should never have been subjected to abuse. She should have had a carefree childhood. And I think her case reminds us of the shocking scale of historical abuse and failures and inaction to protect children. I admire Louise O'Keeffe, and I join with the Taoiseach in apologising to her for what happened in that school and for the horrendous experience that she had to go through. We have the judgment from the European Court of Human Rights. It's a very substantial judgment. It's about 82 pages of a judgment. We will be discussing that judgment at the government meeting next Tuesday. But this is a government that has also addressed very clearly and very comprehensively the whole issue of the protection of children. It is absolutely and without question a priority for this government. We have now created a dedicated Department of Children and Youth Affairs. We've held a referendum on children's rights. Within the education sector, all schools are required to adhere to child protection procedures, which give direction and guidance to school authorities and school personnel in the implementation of Children First when dealing with allegations and suspicions of child abuse. All primary schools now fully implement the Stay Safe programme, which plays a valuable role in helping children to develop the skills necessary to enable them to recognise and resist abuse and potentially abusive situations. The Child and Family Agency is being officially launched today. It will be the first agency dedicated to supporting our children and families and to promoting the development, welfare and protection of our children. Minister Fitzgerald has published updated Children First guidelines and led a national effort to improve awareness of the need to report child protection concerns, leading to a major increase in reports, indeed up by a third on 2011. Minister Fitzgerald has also published the heads of the Children First legislation. The revised bill will be published in March. The legislation will place obligations on professionals and organisations working with children to report suspected child protection concerns, to share information and to engage in interagency and multidisciplinary working. The Minister for Justice has also commenced the criminal justice Withholding of Information on Offences Against Children and Vulnerable Persons Act 2012, and it is now the responsibility of every member of society to protect and defend children from sexual and other abuse. It is no longer acceptable, and should never have been accepted, that secrecy or ignorance on the part of those with knowledge of what were criminal offences could protect those who perpetrated those crimes. We will, as I say, be considering the implications of the judgment at the government meeting on Tuesday.
Thank you. Deputy MacDonald.
Not alone should Louise O'Keeffe not have suffered abuse at the tender age of 8 in what should have been a very safe environment of her primary school. Louise O'Keeffe should not have been harangued, bullied and threatened by the state. And I'm sure you will agree with me on that point. But that is precisely what happened through the High Court, to the Supreme Court, and as far as the European Court for Human Rights. And Tánaiste, it was your government, on your behalf, that argued the case against Louise O'Keeffe as recently as a year ago. And that draws a very serious question mark over what you would call child abuse being a historical issue. You list your many achievements legislatively, and let me applaud them. They're long overdue and very necessary. But so too is a necessary sea change in terms of how the state responds to the Louise O'Keeffes of this world, because there's an established pattern that the state and government close ranks and try to shut down any call for justice from people like Louise O'Keeffe. And let it be said that all of the protections that now exist and that are now contemplated are a direct result of brave people like Louise O'Keeffe stepping forward. So can you answer my question? I asked you whether or not the Taoiseach's apology and your apology extend to all victims of abuse in primary schools.
Thank you.
I want to know, and I'd like to hear you say very clearly on the record today, that you now, your government and the state now, fully accepts that the state has a liability for the abuse suffered by all of these survivors, and that indeed the state has a liability for any current or future instances of abuse of that nature. We can all agree.
Deputy, please, would you recognise the chair? Thank you.
Of this judgment, but what we need to hear now from government is clear words.
Deputy, you didn't hear me. You're way over your time.
Apology to one and all.
Well, first of all, again, I make it very clear that we apologise to Louise O'Keeffe. She should not have suffered what she suffered, and apologise to her for what occurred in that school. As you know, as you know, the Supreme Court handed down a judgment on this case. I think it was actually 2009, certainly before. Sometime before we came into office, and that was the legal position at the time. As you know, when you raise the issue about the state accepting liability for current and for future cases, what happens in our schools, I think there are very significant implications in the European Court of Human Rights judgment. We've had a system in this country of schools operating under a system of patronage. My understanding of the Supreme Court judgment in 2009 was that it accepted that system of patronage, and that therefore ultimate liability did not rest with the state. The judgment of the European Court of Human Rights, in my view, has very serious implications for the relationship between the state and the patronage of our schools. As you know, the Minister for Education has already undertaken a process of considering the whole issue of patronage of our schools. I think that issue is now going to be given an added significance by the judgment in this case, but that is obviously one of the issues, and you raised particularly about what will the situation be for current and for future responsibility by the state. That's among the issues that government will have to consider arising out of this judgment. I believe that the implications of it are very profound for the patronage system of schools and for the relationship now between the state and patrons of schools.
Deputy Healy.
Tánaiste, the policies of successive Irish governments have allowed an elite golden circle of the rich and powerful in this country to obtain obscene levels of wealth, while the vast majority have seen their incomes reduced and struggle day in, day out to make ends meet. Irish society is and is becoming more and more unequal. That is the message coming from the meeting in Davos last week and the Paris School of Economics. It is the message coming from Oxfam. It's the message coming from our own Centre Statistics Office and from the Economic and Social Research Institute. It's also the message, Taoiseach, coming from Irish Water's huge payments to consultants, many of them the same companies, individuals who were paid for bad advice and bad oversight during the boom. It's a message coming from the payment of bonuses, the breach of pay limits for government advisers and the payment of huge pensions, and the list goes on. The Paris School of Economics in this recent study showed that 1% of the wealthiest 1% of people in Ireland own 10% of national income and is the 7th worst in inequality terms of the 18 countries studied. Accumulated wealth is even more significant and stark. The 5% of wealthiest families in this country own 47% of the wealth. And since your government came to power, the wealthiest 300 individuals in this country have gained €9 billion or €30 million each. The Central Statistics Office have told us that during the course of the recession, the wealthiest 10% of people in this country have seen their incomes rise, while the other 90% have seen their incomes fall. And the fall has got bigger as incomes have got smaller.
Question, please.
The Economic and Social Research Institute have independently studied the last 3 budgets and found it to be regressive. And that means that the budgets have taken the most from those that have the least. Low and middle income families...
Sorry, Deputy, this is not speech time, this is question time. Would you put your question?
I'm putting the question out, Ceann Comhairle. Low and middle income families have had their incomes undermined. They've been fleeced by increased taxes, unfair household tax.
Deputy, I won't ask you again. Would you put your question, please, not statements?
How in those circumstances, Tánaiste, how in those circumstances can your government justify introducing a new regressive water tax on these families who are already at their wits' end?
Thank you. Tánaiste.
Well, I share with Deputy Healy a wish to see equity in our society and to see fair taxation and to see that those who are in the best position to make a contribution to the finances of the state do so. The problem is that every time that we propose any measures in that regard, Deputy Healy, you oppose them. This government, for example, introduced a number of measures in relation to the increasing of capital taxation, capital gains tax, capital acquisitions tax, dirt tax on deposits. To my recollection, Deputy Healy, you opposed all of those. When we introduced a property tax, my recollection is that you opposed that as well. I'm certainly open, Deputy Healy, to hearing from you specific proposals about either tax measures or measures that will contribute to greater equity. There's no point coming into the Dáil, Deputy Healy, and getting up and bemoaning inequality and excessive wealth and all of that, and then opposing every measure that is introduced to deal with it. We have now, if you look at the OECD examination of taxation system, you mentioned the top 1%, Deputy, top 1% of earners in this country now pay about 20% of the income tax. The top 5% that you mentioned as well, they now pay around 40% of all of the income tax that's paid in this country. The OECD consider the Irish tax system to be now one of the most progressive in the OECD system. But I'm open to hearing any specific and worthwhile proposals that you have, Deputy Healy, to improve on that.
Thank you. Deputy Healy, 1 minute, thank you.
Well, we've just heard the usual spin and indeed untruths from the Tánaiste. I, of course, have proposed wealth and assets tax in this chamber on numerous occasions, and indeed in budget submissions. And of course, the top 1%, indeed the top 10% in this country, have a completely disproportionate share of national income, and your government has refused to implement a wealth or an assets tax. But I want to say this to you, Tánaiste. You're on record as opposing water charges, and if I could quote something you said, and I'm quoting, the PAYE taxpayer has already paid enough for local services and should not have to pay again. In 1994, you said they have imposed a residential property tax. This is the Fianna Labour government,
Thank you.
and are now making us pay for water as well. And in 1997, you said when water charges were abolished, you said water charges were a form of double taxation, and the government were right to abolish them.
Would you put
now,
your supplementary question?
In circumstances where you're on record on this, in circumstances where the vast majority of people in this country are fleeced and have been crucified over the last number of years, in those circumstances where you have access to wealth and assets tax of very rich people in this country, will you and your government now withdraw the water charges proposed to commence in November of this year?
OK, well, let's take the issue of wealth taxes. There are three essential forms of wealth, Deputy Healy.
Sorry, would you mind, please? Listen to the reply, whether you like it or not.
There are three essential forms. There are three essential forms of wealth. There's property, pensions are a large part of wealth these days, and there's money. On all of those three areas of wealth, this government has introduced additional taxes. We've introduced property tax. We've introduced additional capital taxes. We've introduced an additional tax on pensions that yield over $60,000 a year, and we've also introduced additional taxes on money. Now, it's all very well, you see, this idea of coming in and saying, well, let's tax wealth. Now, that's a grand idea, and it sounds great and wonderful, until the government actually comes to do it. And then when the government comes to do it, in reality, Deputy Healy opposes it every particular time.
Sorry, Deputy Brown, would you please?
In relation to the issue,
Sorry, would you mind, please? We're over time. Now, if you don't want to hear the reply, I'll just cut off the debate. Thank you.
In relation to the issue of water, as you know, Deputy Healy, this government has decided that we are going to make sustainable provision for water services in this country for probably the next quarter century or more. That's a prudent thing to do, because the previous government didn't do that. We have made it clear in our programme for government that there will be a charging arrangement which will be based on a metered system, that there will be a free water allowance for households, and that charging for water will be on a metered basis beyond that free allowance.
Thank you.
And instead of exaggerating and telling people that that this cost is going to be very excessive, you can be sure that the government is very much on the side of families and households on this issue.
Thank you. That completes leaders' questions for today.